So let's just talk about what damages endothelium. You said a couple of things, and I want to be very clear about this. Neither you nor I believe that LDL itself can damage the endothelium. And that is exactly what the LDL hypothesis rests upon, right? If we cannot show, and I do not believe there's any evidence in the literature in medicine today to definitively show that LDL damages the endothelium, then the entire LDL hypothesis falls apart right there immediately, right?
Well, yes, and I think there isn't any evidence. I mean, the problem with a lot of the studies is they're done called in vitro. So they get a layer of cells, they stick them in a test tube, and then they expose them to vastly high concentrations of something. But of course, the problem with this is that normally the endothelium it's got all sorts of other things attached to it and supporting it and helping it inside our body. So the repair systems can't exist inside a test tube. So you've already got rid of that aspect.
Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. What is up, you guys? Another week is upon us. I am in New York right now. If you are listening to this on Tuesday, March the 10th, I am in New York City doing all kinds of fun stuff, and I am going to be at Belcampo in Hudson Yards tonight. If you're listening to this after Tuesday, then you might have missed it. But you should not miss my book, The Carnivore Code. It's out now, thecarnivorecodebook.com. Check it out. It's an Amazon bestseller. We'll get it on the New York Times list soon. I am totally confident because I'm actually in New York City talking to some publishers about broader distribution since it's been such a popular book. I'm so glad you guys are digging it. Please check it out. Please leave me a review on Amazon. Let me know what you think of the book. I appreciate you all so much. Please also leave me a review for this podcast on iTunes. It helps me get it further along the iTunes continuum and more people listen to it. So it's growing so fast. It has almost 600 reviews. This podcast has been out less than a year. That's amazing. You're amazing. You are radical. Thank you all for your support so much. I am so privileged, so deeply grateful to be able to do this work. I love you all deeply. So this week I have Dr. Malcolm Kendrick on the show. Those of you who are interested in cholesterol and lipids will know that this is a fascination of mine. This is really the sharp tip of the spear, as Dave Feldman would say, when it comes to ketogenic diets, carnivore diets, really diets in general that are high in saturated fat. I talk about all of this in the Carnivore Code, reasons that I do not believe we should fear elevated LDL in the setting of ketogenic diets, reasons that I do not believe we should fear saturated fat, and reasons that both of those things might be elevating LDL in a non-pathogenic way. Everyone is talking about coronavirus right now. Well, guess what? If you got my insider this week, or at least the abbreviated version of the insider that I sent out, I noted an article in there in which it's referenced by researchers multiple times that LDL is involved in immunologic control. And guess what? Lipoproteins like LDL can be beneficial against viral infections. Is it possible that a higher LDL on a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet could be protective against viruses like coronavirus? It's possible. We don't know, but I think it's totally possible, plausible, and guess what? We're going to find out because this virus is spreading. So do the things you should be doing, take the precautions you should take, but don't fear coronavirus. Live a radical life. Think about nutrition. I think those are your best defenses. Get sleep, take care of yourself, and realize that, hey, this is a really interesting thing. Maybe a higher LDL is beneficial here. It's apostasy. It's heretical notions, I know, but we're going to talk all about it with Malcolm Kendrick. He's an expert on this. He and I had a great conversation. It's almost 2 hours. It's a long one, you guys, but I think you will really like it. He is a GP in the UK and has an amazing accent, as you will hear. He is the author of The Cholesterol Con and Doctoring Data. Check out his stuff. You will enjoy it, and I know you will like our conversation on this podcast. Like I said at the beginning, I hope to see all of you, well, that would be a really big packed restaurant, but I hope to see many of you at Belcampo in Hudson Yards in New York City on March the 10th. I'm going to be there signing books and eating some of the organic, grass-fed grass-finished meat that Belcampo makes oh so well. You guys, this is probably some of the best meat I've ever eaten in my life. I get bone-in ribeyes from them every month, and I look forward to those steaks like nothing else. They are rich, they are fatty, they are so freaking good. You can use the code CarnivoreMD at belcampo.com to get 20% off your offer. Again, they are a regenerative farm. They are doing the good work. They are raising their cows so well, and you can tell in the meat. This is amazing nutritive meat that is giving us big brains, as I talk about in the book, and healthy everythings, healthy muscles, healthy libidos, healthy minds, everything, healthy everything. It gives you healthy everything, healthy eyes, healthy pancreases, whatever, healthy livers, healthy hearts. These are the nourishing things for humans. Check out belcampo.com. Use CarnivoreMD there for 20% off. You can also check out my people, my wondrous boys and girls who are my friends, my tribe at White Oak Pastures. You guys know them, whiteoakpastures.com, but they are a 6th generation, 150 year in the family farm. They are regenerative for the last 20 years. They are the mothership, in my opinion. They're really how I learned about the regenerative agriculture movement, which can sequester carbon into the soil and increase the organic matter there. The meat from White Oak Pastures is really unparalleled. If you put a steak from White Oak and a steak from Belcampo in front of me, it's the best day ever when that happens. If I get one or the other, I'm happy. You can use the code CarnivoreMD at whiteoakpastures.com for 10% off your first order. And May 1st to 3rd, we are doing an event at White Oak Pastures called White Oak Chella. I hope to see you guys all there. I'm just a gallivanting fool, you guys. I just love traveling and seeing you guys, high-fiving you and hugging you and steak dancing with all of you. But White Oak Pastures is hosting this event. We did it last year. It was amazing. Horseback riding, axe throwing, I almost said axe throwing, all kinds of good stuff, bonfires, steak dancing, and a lot of good meat. You're going to hear talks from me and other people who are going to be at that event who are super smart, and we're going to talk about all kinds of stuff. I will record a live podcast at White Oak Chella. I want to see you guys all there. It is a good time, and really it's tribal. It's community. It means so much to me to be gathered with people who really are healthy and happy, and so we all support each other. It's really cool. So check out whiteoakpastures.com, CarnivoreMD for 10% off your order if it's your first time. And if not, give them a call, tell them you know me, and maybe they'll hook you up with some stuff on special. I want you guys all to know about my amazing community at Ancestral Supplements, ancestralsupplements.com. You can use the code SALADINOMD for 10% off on their Shopify site. As you know, they are grass-fed, grass-finished, desiccated organ supplements encapsulated into a gelatin capsule conveniently for traveling. So I'm going to New York this week. You better believe I'm bringing some Ancestral Supplements with me because it's hard to put brain in my carry-on. And I wouldn't want to do that anyway. But I can put brain everywhere else, right? And I can put desiccated heart there. I can put all the good stuff I like in my carry-on bag because it's encapsulated and it is fantastic and it nourishes us so well. Last week on the podcast with El Russ, we talked about thyroid, and I mentioned the desiccated thyroid from Ancestral Supplements. This week, I want to tell you again about the newest one they've got out, which just keeps selling out because it's amazing. It's called MOFO, the Male Optimization Formula. You can imagine it has some testicle in it. It also has some bone marrow and some liver and some other good stuff, prostate as well. But we are talking about healthy arteries and veins today with Malcolm Kendrick. And guess what? Healthy arteries and veins do. They help men have erections, and they help all of us have healthy, happy sexual lives. So I definitely eat testicle in my life. I think it's a great adjunct to my diet, and I can't always travel with a testicle to New York City, in which case I will bring some MOFO to stay sexually healthy, or at least encourage the ingestion of the organs that are involved in sexual health, which I think may certainly be helpful for all of us in many nutritive ways. So check out ancestralsupplements.com, use SaladinoMD at their Shopify site. You guys know they are putting back in what the modern world has left out, and my goodness, I am going to the modern world in New York City. I'm doing it for you all because I love you. And I'm going to try and put back some things that have been left out of that as best I can. You better believe I'm going to be eating some grass-fed steaks and some organs while I'm there. My last sponsor this week is Future. I've talked about them a few times in the past. They're doing a cool thing, you guys. If you've got an iWatch, you can get a personal trainer specifically on your iWatch. It's pretty cool. instead of paying a personal trainer at the gym all the time, you can get a one-on-one personal trainer, world-class personal trainer that will keep up with your schedule, your routine, your goals, your progress. They check in with you daily on your iWatch, Apple Watch, and you will hear from them and what is going on all the time. They will give you encouragement, and it is much less expensive than having a personal trainer all the time. It's very useful for all of us to have somebody keeping us accountable. So check out Future. If you don't have an Apple Watch, they will send you one, which is pretty cool when you sign up. And like I said, much cheaper than a trainer, somebody that is world-class, personalizing your workout, tailored specifically for your schedule, and they will keep you accountable. It's pretty cool. I tried it. I really liked it. Sign up for Future today at tryfuture.com/SaladinoMD. Get your first 2 weeks with your personal trainer for $1. That's tryfuture.com/SaladinoMD for 2 weeks, only $1, tryfuture.com/SaladinoMD to check that out. Let me know what you guys think of this one, because I think it's a cool thing they're doing here, and it's something that's pretty unique. We all need that encouragement. So without further ado, on to the podcast with my man, Malcolm Kendrick. Listen after for what's going on with me. I love you all.
Malcolm Kendrick, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's so great. I'll just start it over. I'll just stop. All right. Malcolm Kendrick, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This is going to be a fun one.
Thanks very much for inviting me. I hope I'm my time zones. We managed to get our time zones sorted out, so it is officially 4 o'clock in the UK, 8 o'clock in the morning in Pacific time. So we're speaking across continents.
We're speaking across continents. This is the magic of the interwebs, and I think that across these continents, across these interweb connections, will flow many exciting ideas for people to hear about this morning. And so I'm so stoked to talk about this stuff. Lots of people who listen to me know that I'm fascinated by cholesterol and atherosclerosis, and I've had many previous discussions on my podcast with Dave Feldman, Ira Cummins, Nadir Ali. If people want more background, I would recommend they listen to those episodes. And we're going to be digging into all of that today. So get ready, you guys, for a pretty technical podcast. And just like I said at the beginning of the podcast with Ivor, I'm always excited to have people on the show with accents, because I think it makes it very interesting. And I know that everyone will appreciate your accent today. So from me and all of my listeners, thank you for being British. Or are you Scottish?
Well, I'm Scottish. I don't have a very Scottish accent. I get accused of being Irish from time to time. So I have to dissuade them of that horrible slur. Born in Scotland, lived in England for the last 30 years. So I'm probably about half and half, yeah.
Well, tell us about your story. You know, you're a doctor there in England. And how did you get interested in this fascinating rabbit hole of cholesterol and LDL and atherosclerosis? What's the backstory here, Malcolm?
Well, I'm now very old. But when I was at medical school in Aberdeen, in Scotland had the highest rate of heart disease in the world. I think that's true, because sometimes when you look back, you find the statistics are dodgy, but it's very definitely one of the highest that there was. So at the time, the explanation was, well, the Scots eat a terrible diet, and primarily that was considered the reason. In fact, the deep fried Mars bar, I don't know if you've ever heard of it. You get a Mars bar, you put it in a deep fryer and eat it. I have done this, and I have to say, if you've eaten one, you'll never eat another one again, because it's disgusting. So it's a bit of a mythical thing, but anyway, the Scots have a terrible diet. That's why they eat all this horrible fat. Their cholesterol goes high, and they die of heart disease. That was the explanation. That's going back more than 30 years, probably even 40 years. But I started looking at it because I was very interested. I traveled to France quite a lot, and they have a very low rate of heart disease, always have, continues to be very low. And I looked at their diet, and it consisted almost entirely of saturated fat. And I thought, well, why aren't they getting heart disease? So I started thinking, well, maybe there's something not quite right here. Maybe there's something else going on. And I started down, if you like, the rabbit hole. And once you start down this particular rabbit hole, you begin to realize that absolutely everything you're told about the dietary aspect, the cholesterol aspect, is bunk. And then you find yourself thinking, well, am I just gone mad? I'm a lunatic? Because everyone else is saying one thing, and I'm saying and thinking another thing. So you do find yourself in an isolated position, and less isolated maybe now. But I've got to tell you that in the mid-1980s, as far as I was aware, I was the only person in the world who didn't think that cholesterol caused heart disease or that saturated fat had anything to do with it. And yes, the internet has had a benefit for me, and I've managed to connect with people across the world who've looked at it as well and come to the same conclusions for much the same reasons, I think. And then after that, you think, well, how on earth did anyone ever think this differently? What happened? So you do find yourself sitting at right angles to, I don't know if you've ever seen that, the Stranger Things on Netflix, where there's an upside down world, which is sitting just underneath our world. I sometimes feel I'm sitting in the I'm sitting in the upside down world and thinking, am I upside down or is everyone else upside down? I think everyone else is upside down and I'm the right way around, but you can't be sure.
I think that's a fantastic metaphor for this experience. And you are in good company here. I am with you. I do not believe that our current paradigm of LDL being the big bad guy or being enough to initiate atherosclerotic plaque on its own, or LDL rising in the setting of insulin sensitivity on a low carb or ketogenic diet is a bad thing. And we're going to talk about all of that today. And in the world of the carnivore diet, in which I squarely position myself, there are many other things which we probably won't talk about today, and which I also feel like I am sitting at a complete 180-degree angle. I'm in the opposite world from people, saying maybe vegetables aren't as good for us as we believe, and you may or may not believe that, or maybe fiber isn't so necessary for humans. But you know what I think is so cool is that we get to have these conversations now, and that people can start thinking outside of the box, because I think most people today who listen to this podcast, my audience is pretty darn sharp, you guys. I appreciate you all. Realize that humans don't have it all figured out. This is one of the funny things. Maybe this happened to you when you were in medical school. We don't have it all figured out. But as humans, we're quite tribal. And anytime anyone suggests something that is outside of the norm, they are just incredibly vilified. When I was in medical school, we were told 50% of what you learn is wrong. But then when you question what you learn in medical school, everyone throws tomatoes at you. And you think, well, yes, we should be critical of new ideas, but isn't it okay to question things and think outside of the box? Surely you have received lots of criticism for thinking outside of the box. What's your experience with all of this been?
Well, luckily being Scottish, I've got a pretty cast iron outer core. I think if people are attacking you, that's a good sign. I think one of the phrases I use when the flak is at its greatest, you're over the target. People aren't interested in attacking you if they don't feel vulnerable. If they feel vulnerable, it's because they know that what they're actually protecting is potentially wrong. When you come across absolutely certain facts, if I was to say I don't believe antibiotics kill bacteria, I think people would just look at me and go, well, let's move on. They wouldn't even bother connecting with you, because you're so obviously an idiot and wrong,
right,
that there's no point in even having that debate or discussion. I don't believe the moon rotates around the earth. I could have said that 400 years ago and picked a fight with somebody, but nowadays it's just certain. So I'm pretty sure that when people are attacking you, one of the people that I communicate with, Uffe Ravneskov, who started the International Network of Cholesterol Skeptics, in 1991, his book The Cholesterol Myth was burnt live on television studio by experts in the area. And I just think, well, we've had burning of books throughout history. It's never really reflected well on the burners of the books.
That's so true.
So when people are attacking me, I just think, well, you're making yourself look stupid. You're not making me look stupid, I don't think. I've been attacked. I was wiped off Wikipedia by I believe, although it's very difficult to know for sure, but a number of others that were holding views that animal fat was quite healthy were removed at the same time. So it appears to have been a coordinated attack by basically what appeared to be the vegans. I have nothing particularly against vegans, but they do tend to attack you and vilify you rather outrageously, when all you're trying to do is say, well, I'm not talking about other things, I'm just talking about the science here. And can we have an argument about the science? I have a blog, and occasionally a sort of very pro-vegan person will appear and start being quite aggressive, and I try to engage them in conversation, and then they usually just disappear because it's annoying, because I'd like to have a conversation. I'd like to change minds, and I'd like them to try and change my mind, because in my view, science is a progress of constantly battling against other people refining and strengthening your thinking, changing your ideas. But unfortunately, in this area, you really are. I might as well turn around and face the wall behind me and bang my head against it repeatedly for all the good it does. So, you're not going to convince certain people. Some people will attack you for various reasons, but I'm not remotely bothered by that. I have had a bit more than just that happening, which is slightly more worrying, but I'm not going to go into that at the moment. Yes, you do get attacked, and you'll know that Tim Noakes in South Africa, who a very, very vocal high-fat, low-carb advocate, was they basically tried to kick him off, attack him, and stop him being a doctor or being on the doctor's register. Gary Fetke in Australia, the same things have happened. You can go through the doctors. Anna Kowalquist in Sweden, one of the earlier people. Again, they tried to destroy her reputation or credibility and throw her off being a doctor. So, I mean, these things are going on. Luckily, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, is got a long history of being open to different ideas, and it's very difficult to attack somebody effectively here. I won't get attacked and thrown off being a doctor, for instance. So, a long answer to your question, but yes, you just have to develop a bit of a thick hide and say, well, I'm just going to carry on because I believe this is right. And if someone comes up with a killer fact that says you're wrong, well, I'll change my mind. At least I hope I will be able to do that now.
I love it. I could learn a lot from you. I need to come hang out with you and learn the Scottish way of getting the thick skin. I need a little more Scottish in me, I guess, like I need the thick skin that Malcolm Kendrick has. What's interesting is I hope my book gets burned now. I've got a book coming out, The Carnivore Code. When this podcast comes out, this book is going to be released. And I was recently on the Doctor's TV show here in the United States, and they tried to vilify me like crazy. They ganged up on me. They just interrupted me. It was ad hominem attacks. And you know what? After that TV show, none of them have been willing to engage in a single word of conversation. They won't come on my podcast. They won't do anything. And so it's so silly, right? They want to throw tomatoes when the odds are in their favor, but they don't want to talk on a level playing ground where we're actually going to talk about science. Anyone that listens to this podcast has probably heard of that. So quite interesting. And I love that you bring up that point. The burners of books are not really good people in history, right? We should be open to ideas, and I love it. And I try to engage vegans as well, and often I have the exact same thing happen. They just want to celebrate. They just want to celebrate what appear to be our failures. And I just think humans are tribal, and a lot of people are kind of stuck in a position where they want to be in an echo chamber. And I think that that's an indication of underlying insecurity or just underlying human pain. And so I love that you're just kind of a poised person. This is so great. That's fun. I didn't even expect the podcast to go here in the beginning, but what a great start. That's amazing. Well, let's dig into atherosclerosis. So many people in my community are interested in low carb, high fat diets, like a carnivore diet or a carnivore-ish type diet or a ketogenic diet. One of the things that often, but not always, happens on these diets is that LDL goes up. And that sets off the alarm bells in physicians' offices all over the country. I have clients and people that I talk to on Instagram emailing me every single day. I went to my physician and my LDL is high, quote unquote. And that's all the physician looks at. And people should refer back to the previous episodes I've done for some of the background on this, right? And so this kind of gets right to the central piece of this equation, the point of the spear. And what people are worried about is atherosclerosis, this formation of plaque in the artery wall. And we're going to get into different theories about how that might be happening. But I would love to hear your kind of 15,000 perspective. Let's just start with this, right? Nobody wants to die of a heart attack. We don't want to die of heart disease. It's a big killer, right? What do you think is going on here? How do you see this equation? How do you see all of this playing out kind of broadly? And then we can dig into some of the details. What causes atherosclerosis? What causes heart attacks? What should we be thinking about here?
All right. Well, that's a big one.
I know. Well, we can start broad.
I maybe start with saying that along with Zufir Ravnaskov and a number of others, we wrote a paper about 2 years ago, the most downloaded paper by I've forgotten the name of the publisher now, over the year, which looked at LDL in people over the age of 60. Generally, every study starts at different ages. We did a meta-analysis of LDL And the conclusion was, what we found was that people with higher LDL had a slightly improved mortality over people with lower LDL. And in fact, the people with the lowest LDL had the highest mortality rate. So, I mean, that just, people find that hard to believe, but there's a study from Japan. I mean, you can find these things out, 116-page review, which basically found the same thing, that essentially an LDL, higher LDL appears to be, well, it isn't appear to be, it is associated with increased life expectancy. The difference is not huge, it's not gigantic, but it exists. So therefore, you know, the evidence suggests forget LDL. In fact, nowadays I don't even bother thinking about it. I know whether people are still in this position where it's the thing. I long ago realized that it isn't the thing, and it can't be the thing, and it's something else. So where is this something else? If you're going to say, well, if it isn't LDL, if it isn't cholesterol, if it's not that firing up the arteries, what could it possibly be? And the answer is primarily, I think of it a bit like road damage. If you think of your arteries as like roads, then you know, the roads, or you call them highways in America, but there's cars going over them, lorries going over them, it's raining, it's snowing, and they gradually get attacked and they gradually start to break down. So it's the attack or the assault on the road surface, if you like, that is the thing that triggers the whole process. So it's damage to the artery wall. And the artery wall can be damaged by, there's almost no end to the number of things that can damage an artery wall. Cigarette smoke, diesel fumes, lead poisoning, that's a big one I was looking at recently. Study from America showing that 250,000 cardiovascular deaths a year can be directly related to lead toxicity, which is something no one even talks about. Diabetes, obviously a high blood sugar level can damage it. High blood pressure, turbulent flow can damage it. You can go on and on looking at different things that can cause it. So trying to say there is a single factor that causes it is wrong, because there isn't. What you've got to say is, what is damaging the artery wall? And that's where the process starts. Well, this is obviously what I believe. This hypothesis, in fact, was first proposed in 1856 by a chap called Karl von Rokitansky, who looked at blood clots, and this is in Vienna in the mid-19th century, and said, what am I looking at? He said, what I'm looking at are blood clots in various stages of repair, from a brand new one to, you know, when it's all been kind of gradually turned into other things and it becomes fibrous and it becomes a layer. Anyway, that's what he believed when he was looking at them. So it's not exactly a new idea that blood clots are the thing that are responsible. So essentially, in a sort of nutshell, you damage the artery wall, whatever causes that damage, one of many, many things. Once the damage has occurred, a blood clot will form, must form on top of that. And then you have a blood clot stuck to your artery wall. Once you've got a blood clot stuck to your artery wall, obviously it can't just break off and travel further down the artery. It would just cause mayhem further down. So once it's stuck, it gets shaved down to a degree. And then it has to be covered over, because otherwise, if you don't cover it over, it just stays there. You can't get rid of the whole blood clot, because otherwise you're just going to expose the artery wall underneath again, which will trigger another blood clot. So what happens is, as a new endothelial cells, and endothelium is the thing that lines all arteries, which are floating around in your bloodstream, come along, they're attracted to the area of damage, they cover it over, and then effectively the blood clot is within the artery wall. At which point, normally in most people, it will be broken down and got rid of. However, if the blood clot's big or there's repeated damage in that area, you can get a gradual building up of plaque at that point. And that can then turn into a lipid-filled core, or it can become, over time, it can be calcified. But that's the essential underlying process. Now, the process of endothelial damage, re-endothelialization, and repair is going on. That's a healthy thing. The question is, when does it become unhealthy? It becomes unhealthy when the damage is going faster than the repair. So if you damage the repair systems in the body, then that causes plaques to grow as well. And so when you look at something like, say, diabetes or high blood sugar level, you say, how does that cause heart disease? The same way as, say, smoking causes heart disease. The thing is that with the high blood sugar level, a fact unknown to most people is that your arteries are all lined by a substance called glycocalyx. Introduced a new word time. Nobody's heard of it, but actually it's like a little forest. If you try and pick up a fish, it slips through your hands. It slips through your hands because fish are covered in glycocalyx. very, very slippery, very, very smooth, very, very anticoagulant. So blood clots cannot really form on top of the glycocalyx unless the glycocalyx is damaged. And one of the things that damages the glycocalyx is high blood sugar level. So the glycocalyx is a lipid protein fronds within which are contained anticoagulants, nitric oxide synthase, etc., etc. So your glycocalyx is really, really important. If you damage your glycocalyx, the endothelial cells are then exposed to the blood and all the nasty things that are potentially in the blood, and this is where you get secondary damage. So you can see how, say, smoking and diabetes is going to cause a combined or additional problems, because not only have you got the glycocalyx damage, as you smoke, nanoparticles are absorbed from your lungs. The nanoparticles hit your endothelial cells and kill them. So if you smoke a cigarette, you can actually see if there's a thing called microparticles, which is basically a dead endothelial cell. Microparticles float around in the bloodstream, and you can measure them. And if you get a volunteer to smoke one cigarette, you can see lots of microparticles floating around in the bloodstream. Reassuringly, at the same time, the bone marrow produces more endothelial progenitor cells simultaneously to cover over the areas of damage. So you're triggering both processes, but of course, if you keep smoking and you've got diabetes, and say you've got high blood pressure, and all these other things trigger on top, your endothelium is just going to be, I've had enough, I've given up the ghost. So it's kind of this is a process going on all the time. What you're trying to do is keep your repair in better shape than your damage. And if you can do this, you're not going to develop, or you might even be able to reverse plaque growth, because the body can heal itself. And if you're doing nothing wrong, then hopefully, I know the evidence is not strong here, you can reverse plaques, you can make them shrink down, you can repair them. So in a kind of, I don't know if that made sense, but that's in a kind of supersonic, really simplistic view of looking at it. And then you could say, so anything that, well, I've tried to look at this, anything that's going to cause an increased risk of heart disease does one of three things. It damages the endothelium, it makes bigger, nastier, more difficult to repair clots, which is where the LPA comes in. You can go down that.
And we'll talk about that, yeah.
Damages repair systems. So when you look at things that can increase heart disease, you can also look at steroids. If you take steroids, which are corticosteroids, which are anti-inflammatory, which actually directly interfere with the healing system.
Right.
One of the most powerful drivers of heart disease is a raised cortisol level, raised stress hormones, and or giving people stress hormones to take as a tablet, which is a steroid essentially. And so also immunosuppressants can quite severely increase the risk of heart disease. What's an immunosuppressant? An immunosuppressant is something that interferes with the healing system of the body essentially. So you can damage the healing system, you can increase the damage, you can have bigger, more difficult to clots. And if you look at heart disease as being a combination of these three things, then you can figure how everything kind of fits into the process. So that's where, if you like, over many, many years, my thinking has eventually come to. It was called the thrombogenic hypothesis. Ronald Ross in the 1970s called it the response to injury hypothesis. And other people have called it other things. So, this is not like brand new thinking. It's just trying to bring all the things together. The only thing I can't fit into it, I've never been able to fit into it, is LDL. Because LDL does not and cannot damage the endothelium.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I was going to point out. So I love this model, and I'll just kind of re-summarize it for people to hopefully everyone understands it. Do you know the title? I know people are going to want to see this paper. I referenced this paper that you're talking about with Ufi Ravenscoff in my book, showing that people above 60 years old, there's a slight improvement in mortality with higher LDL. Do you know the title of that paper off the top of your head?
Well, I should do. I was a co-author. But if you went to Google and typed in Ufi Ravenscoff, UFFERAVNSKOV, high LDL, and it's in the BMJ Open, you'll get it. It will come up. Right?
Yes.
The actual title is high LDL is not associated with it's usual. I can't remember the exact
Yes,
wording.
it's something. I was trying to find it on my computer real quick, but I can link to it, or people can find this paper. Certainly, if you search Malcolm Kendrick as an author, Uwe Ravneskov as an author, high LDL is not associated with increased mortality, something like that. We can find the paper; it's out there. But I love this. I love this model. It's almost like a threefold model of heart disease that you're describing here, and it starts with endothelial damage. So if we are in a small little spaceship and traveling around the arteries of our body, these blood vessels, you can look from the bloodstream to the blood vessel, from the inside of your blood vessel toward the blood vessel wall, you will see the endothelium. And as you suggest, this endothelium is not a flat layer of cells. It has a hair. It has hair on it, almost like the hair on your arm, right? The glycocalyx. It is a forest of fronds, as you described, fronds. And we have the same glycocalyx in our gut. We have an endothelium in our gut as well. We have an endothelial layer in the gut, which can become leaky. And there are these glycoproteins that are these finger-like projections from the endothelium of all the cells that are endothelial in our body, and they form a forest. And this, as you say, this is sort of an electrochemical forest in which nitric oxide is produced. We'll talk about nitric oxide in this podcast. It's a molecule that has to do with health of the endothelium and vasodilatation. And that frond-like network of glycoproteins on the surface of the endothelium, which is the innermost layer of the blood vessels, we know that can become damaged. And when the glycocalyx becomes damaged, the endothelium can become damaged. And that is probably the first step in atherosclerosis, according to this model. Now, I just want people to understand, I love that you talk about this fish analogy. If you have a fish in your hand, you try and hold it, it's slippery because of the glycocalyx. You can't see it, but we should have the same sort of slipperiness on the inside of our arteries, and that then blood will flow in a laminar, in a linear fashion through the arteries. As you suggest, sometimes or often what we see with atherosclerotic plaque is that it forms more commonly at the branch point of arteries. And this may be because the turbulent flow at those places. If people are familiar with fluid dynamics, at a branch point, you get turbulence. And turbulence can cause that glycocalyx to be a little damaged. Now, as you are suggesting, this process of damaging the endothelium probably happens all the time for all of us throughout our lives. And then there's a middle piece where there's a clot forming, perhaps, and then there's a repair process. And I love that we'll talk about all of these pieces in the podcast. If that repair process gets slowed down or gets out of control, is happening more quickly, or if the repair process is slowed down and doesn't happen quickly enough to repair the damage, then the atherosclerotic burden kind of builds up. One of the things I mentioned in my book is that all placental mammals get atherosclerosis. This is well known within the animal kingdom. So atherosclerosis certainly seems like it could be a part of a normal process of repair of the arteries. And I love that you're suggesting that it's just a balance between how much is happening, sort of this turnover of the repair. If the repair gets to be too great or the repair gets slowed down, we run into problems. So let's just talk about what damages endothelium. You said a couple of things, and I want to be very clear about this. Neither you nor I believe that LDL itself can damage the endothelium. And that is exactly what the LDL hypothesis rests upon, right? If we cannot show, and I do not believe there's any evidence in the literature in medicine today to definitively show that LDL damages the endothelium, then the entire LDL hypothesis falls apart right there, immediately, right?
Well, yes, and I think there isn't any evidence. I mean, the problem with a lot of the studies is they're done called in vitro. So they get a layer of cells, they stick them in a test tube, and then they expose them to vastly high concentrations of something. But of course, the problem with this is that normally the endothelium it's got all sorts of other things attached to it and supporting it and helping it inside our body. So the repair systems can't exist inside a test tube. So you've already got rid of that aspect. So there's so much that's missing. But even if you do all these things, I don't think anyone now is suggesting. So they've changed. As part of the reason why they've changed the hypothesis to oxidized LDL, which when I speak to a chemist, they just laugh at the concept of oxidized LDL. But however, what we'll say is that if something floats around in the bloodstream for long enough, there is a bit of oxidation, like call it rust. It's not really rust, but we'll call it rust. And so rusty LDL is potentially got more toxicity and could cause more damage to the glycocalyx and the artery wall. Now there is some evidence of this I'm unwilling. I'm not very keen on it. I know that Ivor Cummings is very keen on it, but I'm less keen on it. I say endothelial cells actually have specific LOX1 receptors, which is receptors for oxidized LDL. They also have a thing called a 3-BAP receptor. So damaged and wonky LDL is very rapidly taken out of the circulation, not only by the endothelial cells, but also in the liver. The liver is turning it over really, really quickly. In fact, I was asked by someone to provide an explanation of what happens with VLDL, and not go into that, but after a meal, if you eat a high carbohydrate meal, your VLDL, your triglyceride concentration can go 4 or 5 times as high. The only source of LDL is VLDL, and the LDL concentration remains the same, which means that 80 or 90 or 95% of the VLDL that turns to LDL is just immediately removed from the circulation, along with oxidized LDL. Again, you can stick high concentrations of oxidized LDL in test tubes, expose them to endothelium, and it appears to cause damage. But the total amount of oxidized LDL you have in your bloodstream is absolutely minute. It's almost unmeasurably small, because the body just takes it away. So it's a kind of explanation to kind of continue to make the LDL hypothesis continue to live on, but it doesn't work for me. Maybe there is some damage from oxidized LDL, but compared to, say, smoking a cigarette, it's like, I don't know what it's like. I could use rude analogies, but it's just the smallest, tiniest thing versus a huge, gigantic thing. It's grasping at the tiniest straw to maintain the hypothesis, in my opinion.
So it's quite interesting that you mentioned this, that endothelial cells in the liver have specific receptors for oxidized LDL that take it up out of the circulation, probably recycle it and get rid of it. I just want to back up for people listening. And again, I would refer people to previous podcasts I've done where we talk about the cholesterol transport system in the human body. But in a basic high level, and correct me if I get any of this wrong in your opinion, when we eat fat, it's usually in the form of dietary triglycerides that get taken up in the gut and they form particles called chylomicrons, which are marked by a specific apolipoprotein, B48. Those travel in the lymph, they go to the liver, and they kind of get recycled into VLDL, very low density lipoprotein, which is a repackaging of both cholesterol and triglycerides. Yes.
Right. There's only one thing wrong with that.
Okay.
Chylomicrons travel straight from the gut through what they call the thoracic ducts and straight into the bloodstream.
Right, through the lymph.
Yeah, and then they end up in the bloodstream, and they shrink down to chylomicron remnants. They don't become VLDLs. They shrink
in
down
the liver. They sort of go to the liver and
they're reabsorbed into the liver.
Right.
But so I suppose the thing there is that fat, 95% of the fat that you ingest never goes anywhere near the liver. It just goes straight to the cells from the gut and has no impact on the production of VLDL in the liver.
Right.
It's not associated with it at all. So if you eat a high-fat meal, your triglyceride or VLDL level will not go up. Mm-hmm. It's only if you eat a carbohydrate-rich meal that will happen.
Right,
so
right.
That makes sense.
Yes, perfect. Thank you for clarifying that for the listeners. And so what's interesting about this process is that when we eat fat, there are these chylomicrons in the body that are circulating. In the book, I sort of describe them as buses, and they are dropping off precious cargo. And as you're saying, these chylomicrons are becoming smaller. They're becoming remnants because our body is taking up cholesterol and fat from our diet and then circulating it throughout the body because that's valuable nutrients for our body. I think of it as a bus system. People get off the bus gets smaller. The chylomicron bus goes to the liver. The people get off the bus, and then those, the liver can then repackage passengers from the chylomicron bus, or just things it's making in general, triglycerides, cholesterol, into VLDL. VLDL is a bus that departs the liver. It's very low density lipoprotein. And just like chylomicron was circulating in our blood, VLDL circulates in our blood. People get off the bus. Cholesterol, triglycerides get off the bus. The bus becomes smaller. It becomes intermediate density lipoprotein, becomes smaller, and then it becomes low density lipoprotein as the relative concentrations of triglyceride and cholesterol change in that particle as it drops off precious cargo to our body. Then it goes back to the liver, right? Do you think that's reasonable?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much spot on. So yes, I think the interesting thing, possibly within that people I've written about and tried to explain to people is it's the liver can create its own fat as well from carbohydrate, which is really where the fat comes from that goes into VLDL. Because carbohydrates are all converted to sugars, and sugars, fructose and glucose primarily, fructose especially, is turned into fat in the liver in a process called de novo lipogenesis. So it's, when people say that, that eating fat raises your LDL, I always look at them and think, well, since fat doesn't have any effect on VLDL or LDL, it just travels around the body and is got rid of, and therefore can have no effect. But if you eat carbohydrates, we know that creates a spike in VLDL. So the only source of LDL is VLDL, and therefore your VLDL goes shooting through the roof and your LDL is supposed to fall. So what's the explanation? The explanation given by the mainstream is that if you eat saturated fat, it downregulates LDL receptor function in the body. And you think, well, the two things are completely unrelated. This makes absolutely no sense. So as when you start to think about it, the whole underlying process of which they're talking is nonsense. So if you eat, the other thing is, of course, if you eat lots of fat, your body's getting all the cholesterol and fat that it needs from the chylomicrons. So the body doesn't need to make VLDLs because it doesn't have any need to take fat and cholesterol out of the liver, or especially fat out of the liver. So the LDL level actually rises up slightly because the liver says, I've got enough of you. I don't need any more of this at the moment, so I'm not going to absorb it. So therefore, it's a kind of positive thing. It says, I'm fine. All the fat and cholesterol the body needs has already been distributed around. I don't need to make more VLDL, so I don't need the LDL to come back in, because the body needs various proteins that are in the LDL to make more VLDL. That's the only explanation I can think of that makes any sense. Does that make sense to you?
It does. That LDL, and this is important for people to realize that LDL can be derived from VLDL, but then the liver can also take LDL back up. And this is essentially how statin drugs, which hopefully we're going to talk about today, work, is that by inhibiting the production, by starving the liver of cholesterol, by inhibiting the production of cholesterol in the liver is essentially starving for air, quote unquote. The liver is starving for LDL. The liver is starving for cholesterol. It puts more LDL receptors on the surface of the liver, and it says, give me some cholesterol so that I can breathe and make things I need. And it pulls more LDL out of the bloodstream. But when we move out of an LDL-centric perspective here, that may not be a good thing. And there are many downsides to statins. But when we are so myopic and we are only looking at the level of LDL in the body, we get widely misled. So I just want to enumerate for people, I want to focus on all the things that you think can cause endothelial damage. And as we're suggesting, some in the cholesterol world believe that oxidized LDL could cause damage, but it's very clear. I don't think anyone can make a position that non-oxidized LDL or native LDL could be damaging to our arteries. And so if we have lots of LDL around in our body and it's not oxidized, it's pretty hard to make an argument that that's going to be damaging for the arteries as well as in any way. You talked about some of the other ones: smoking, air pollution, lead. There are lots of things that can circulate in our body. Insulin resistance, you said diabetes. That's an interesting mechanism to think about. How does insulin resistance? We know that postprandial hyperglycemia, rising of the blood sugar after a meal, which people might be able to see with a continuous glucose monitor, that affects the glycocalyx negatively. That's probably going to impair nitric oxide synthesis. All of these things, insulin resistance probably being one of the key ones for most people in Western society. It's damaging the endothelium. Can you think of any other things? What do you think of as damaging the arteries? We've probably talked about most of them already.
Oh, well, actually, there's many, many more. But I think that one very interesting area that I looked at, you look at the extremes sometimes to get to find the answers. One of the extremes was I was looking for the condition which was most likely to damage endothelium, and it did nothing else. All right, and I'm going to give you two. The first one is sickle cell disease, and the increased risk of cardiovascular disease in young people with sickle cell disease is 50,000%. Now that's a pretty big risk. Now a lot of that is strokes because of clot formation. But anyway, a sickle cell, as people may not know, is a cell that's shaped like a sickle. It's like a half or a crescent moon. It's got sharp, pointy ends. Now, it's a genetic condition. It's supposed to protect against malaria, but if you have homozygous or both your parents had it, you have severe sickle cell disease. In years gone by, the average life expectancy was 2. So cardiovascular disease wasn't very high on the list of things people worried about. But what happened is once people started living longer because they did blood transfusions and blah, 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 they then started finding that cardiovascular disease was a big problem. And I was looking at a case history of a 14-year-old boy who was admitted with gangrene of his foot. And the gangrene was due to blockage of the arteries, atherosclerosis, calcified atherosclerosis in every single artery in his body. He'd had a stroke when he was 5. His brother had died age 3. And his entire arterial tree was just mangled. And if you look at sickle cell disease again, you find that this is the case. What's the reason for this? Well, you've got sharp, pointy blood cells hammering through your bloodstream, stripping off the endothelium. And one of the things that happens in sickle cell disease is you get a very large spleen, because the spleen is where red blood cells are removed. And if you've got sickle cell disease, there's bigger turnover. But quite often they can be damaged because they're so large. And if you take them out and look at the arteries in the spleens, they're full of atherosclerosis. So here we have almost a perfect example. We have one thing, no other risk factors, nothing else going on, just damage to the endothelium. And you have extreme and severe atherosclerosis at very young ages. Now moving into another condition, I said, well, if you could find a drug that destroyed nitric oxide synthesis production and damaged endothelial cell production, progenitor cell production, and in fact, really sort of destroyed the protection and repair systems of the body, would that increase the risk of heart disease? And you say, well, no one's going to make a drug like that, and no one's going to give it to anyone if they do. The answer is they do make a drug like that, and it's given to people. And they're called vascular endothelial growth factor inhibitors, VEGFI. The vascular endothelial growth factor is a substance produced by the body to make endothelial cells grow, to be repaired, increases nitric oxide synthesis. Now, the reason why you give people this drug is because when you have cancers, certain cancers, they have to develop their own extra blood supply. It's called angiogenesis, new blood supply, in order to grow. So if you can find a drug that stops these blood cells from being made, then you destroy the blood supply to the tumor and the tumor dies. And this works. Now the commonest drug of this is the most widely known is called Avastin, VEGFI inhibitor. You can also use Avastin to inject it into the eyeballs in people who have excess production of new blood vessels in the eye. That's called macular degeneration, which is the commonest cause of blindness in the Western world. So you inject this stuff into the eye, it stops the new blood cells from forming, the new blood vessels from forming, and it prevents macular degeneration. The only problem is it knocks your nitric oxide synthesis to virtually zero. It hammers it through the floor. Now, the very first vascular endothelial growth factor inhibitor was actually thalidomide. Thalidomide, that's why it caused short arms and legs at certain parts of the pregnancy, because the blood vessels wouldn't grow when you were given thalidomide. So your arms and legs couldn't grow because there was no blood supply to them. So the arms, well, didn't exist. You just had hands at the end of your shoulders and feet at the bottom of your hips. And obviously, if you'd taken it earlier, probably all sorts of other things would have happened and the fetus would never have survived. But for the ones who got it at a particular time when the limbs were supposed to grow, they didn't. Now, thalidomide is also used as a cancer treatment to prevent angiogenesis. So you say, well, what happens then? Does this increase the risk of heart disease? If you take Avastin, will it increase the risk of heart disease? Well, it does. And in fact, over a 2-year period in some trials, it increased the risk of heart disease death by 1,200% over a 2-year period. In fact, it was nearly withdrawn because of this adverse effect. Now, no one seems to have drawn a conclusion from this and said, you know what, if you get rid of vascular endothelial growth factor, which is the thing that promotes and nurtures new endothelial cells, stimulates its growth in the bone marrow, and increases nitric oxide synthesis, do you not think maybe that's going to have a problem if this hypothesis is correct? Well, it does cause a huge problem, and yet no one seems to have gone, well, why is that? Someone's like, and of course, ironically, the greatest irony is is that one of the drugs that they give people now when they're given Avastin are ACE inhibitors, which are normally used to lower the blood pressure. One of the primary effects of ACE inhibitors is that they increase nitric oxide synthesis. That's how I believe. That's actually how they work. It's not supposed to be how they work, but it is how they work. And guess what? They've now found that drugs that increase nitric oxide synthesis, like ACE inhibitors, increase the risk of lung cancer. So, big surprise. Why would that be? Because you're increasing angiogenesis. So you've got to be very careful with these things.
Right. We can't go.
You want to have a high nitric oxide level, but if you put it too high, be careful.
That's quite interesting. So I want to highlight that point so you're saying, this is so fascinating, that ACE inhibitors, so these are angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, and there are also angiotensin receptor blockers, ARBs. The most common ACE inhibitor is lisinopril. There are other ones, fosinopril, except they have pril on the end of their name. And then there are angiotensin receptor blockers, ARBs, like the sartans, losartan. I used to prescribe these all the time when I was a physician assistant working in cardiology. And that's so interesting that a drug that is an ACE inhibitor, so an angiotensin receptor, or an angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor, that's going to increase nitric oxide, and that's going to increase the rate of lung cancer because you're going to increase angiogenesis. I bet they're going to increase the rates of other cancers. So it's a balance. We can't go mucking around with nature. We just need to correct these things at their root. Interestingly, when I was in college at William & Mary, I did molecular biology research in Xenopus, a frog, on a gene in the frog called Zangio, Xanzgio, Zangio. I think it was also called Feather1. There was a gene that we found in that frog that was involved in angiogenesis, and we were trying to knock it out. So we were getting funding from cancer, and this is the same kind of mechanism as Avastin, as you're discussing. It's going to knock out this vascular endothelial growth factor, which is needed to make new blood vessels. If you're going to make new blood vessels, you have to have signaling from the bone marrow to make these endothelial progenitor cells. So we're talking about our sort of stem cells that make the lining of the blood vessels. They come from the bone marrow, and if we inhibit the production of those, then according to this theory, this hypothesis, we can't do the proper healing and turnover of our arteries. What do you know? Atherosclerosis gets worse. It's not all about LDL. In fact, it's not at all about LDL. And I love that you highlighted sickle cell, because people can imagine needles in your veins, needles and nails, this very sharp things running through your arteries, which is exactly what sickle cell looks like, damaging those arteries. And then you get massive, extensive atherosclerosis. One of the things that I've heard you say before, which I think is most clarifying with regard to this idea that endothelial damage is probably necessary, is probably the original event in atherosclerotic progression, is that we do not get atherosclerosis in veins, which are lower pressure vascular tree in the human body. But if we transplant that vein into the arterial circulation, like we do with a CABG, a coronary artery bypass graft, it gets atherosclerosis very fast, faster than an artery. And I talk about this in my book. If LDL, or even oxidized LDL, is enough to initiate atherosclerosis on its own, why do we not see atherosclerosis in veins? And this is essentially something that I've heard you say as well. If anything connected with LDL is enough to initiate atherosclerosis, why don't we see atherosclerosis in veins? Because it's all continuous, right? We have the same amount of LDL in our vein as we do in the artery. So this is great. I mean, you have to damage the LDL. Anything else you want to say about that?
Well, I think, I've used this argument myself, is, low pressure, if you look also into the lungs, the pulmonary circulation, obviously you've got two circulations effectively, one around the body, one into the lungs. The blood pressure in the body is, say, 120/70 on average, or whatever it's supposed to be. And in the lungs, it's about 20/8, or even lower than that. And you don't get plaque development in the arteries and veins in the lungs either. So there's very clearly a pressure, turbulence, damage. Your endothelium, I sometimes liken it to a white water, almost a roaring sort of white water river is your arteries. And when you get to the veins, it's more like, when you're reaching the plains before the sea, where the rivers are winding and meandering and going very slowly. But obviously, things that are on the endothelium is under massively less stress, and therefore, if you don't have that level of stress, it doesn't matter what else you do, you ain't going to get plaques developing, because the endothelium just goes, well, there might be smoking, there might be high blood sugar level, but frankly, I don't care, because there's not much going on around here, and I'm not going to fall off and get stripped off under this kind of pressure. So I look at that very simplistically, but I think it works as an idea. I keep people writing to me who say, I'm a physicist, and I can tell you that laminar flow in a high pressure vehicle, blah, 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 doesn't cause any more linear flow. And I said, then if it's going very slowly or at low pressure, I say, well, that's not the point, because what we're really looking at is points where, almost ironically, the lower pressure points in the artery is where there's greater damage. So you see where there's a river and it turns around a corner. Quite often you pull stuff off the inner bank rather than the outer bank. It's almost pushing back. And the other thing that happens, if you put more pressure on endothelial cells, they produce more nitric oxide. They protect themselves. It's the ones on the other side that are kind of taken by surprise, and they just kind of get sucked off. And like the underside of a plane wing where you've got the vacuum pressure, that's actually where the turbulence and the damage is going on. So it's not just the pressure; it's the whole kind of turbulenty, non-laminar flow, which I can't really understand. And people keep sending me enormously complicated mathematical equations and expect me to go, oh, well, that's clear.
Yeah. So the veins are the lazy river, they're just cruising around, in the blood in the veins, the blood is sitting there in a tube, chilling out on a sunny day in a lazy river at a resort with a Topo Chico in hand. And like you said, arteries are like raging rapids, and you're on a raft in the Grand Canyon, and you're just trying your best. You're banging into rocks. It's just crazy. There was a time that I was in New Zealand, and I was backpacking in New Zealand by myself, and I got lost. I didn't really get lost. I was in a valley in New Zealand called the Matuki Valley. And in New Zealand, they have these wilderness valleys where there are no bridges and no huts. And I was by myself, and overnight it had rained, and the river that I had to cross to get out of this trail that I was backpacking on had flooded. And it was a turbulent mess, and it was just, I was going to die. I would die if I swam that river. And so what I had to do was walk miles downstream without a trail to find the part in the river where it became braided. In the United States, we don't really have braided rivers as much, but in New Zealand and other places I've traveled, you'll see if the listener just looks up braided rivers, as we go further down the vascular tree, as we go further down the river tree, or the river, the course of a river, it becomes much lower pressure. And even though it was the same amount of water, and the same water that I had to swim 5 miles further upstream, and when I walked downstream and I found a braided part of the river, I could swim it. And so I jumped in with my backpack, and I had to swim this flooded river, but because it was braided and there were multiple branches, it was not turbulent. I did not die, so that I can be here talking to you. So, and I want to move on. Let's talk about nitric oxide. But before we do that, I just want to highlight for people something that you and I were talking about before we started the podcast, which is that you and I both agree that LDL also has valuable roles in the human body, that it's protective. And we kind of hinted at this earlier. Chylomicrons, VLDL, LDL, these are particles moving valuable cargo around the human body. I know Ufe has also published papers, which I reference in my book, about the immunologic role of LDL in the human body. But let's talk for a few minutes about the good things that LDL does in the human body. And I just want to set the stage. The way that I frame this in my mind for people, and again, this is just my perspective, is that why would our bodies have evolved something that is clearly valuable, that clearly serves an indispensable role in the human body, like LDL, that is also killing us at the same time?
Well, yeah, of course, that argument makes sense to almost anyone, I would imagine. But it's funny how if you vilify something enough, it just becomes the enemy. I mean, I have heard people writing articles, I've read articles where they've written, basically LDL is like the best level is to be 0. They're actually they honestly think if we can get LDL to 0, this would be a good thing. I said, we'll try that. There is a condition called Smith-Lemmy-Opitz syndrome, right, which is very rare, where you genetically don't produce enough cholesterol. And believe me, you don't want to get to 0, because these are at about an LDL of about 50 or something, 40 or 50. I'm thinking in American terms. And their brains don't develop. They develop extra fingers. They last about a year. Their brain doesn't fuse properly. It doesn't have a correct. Their neurological system is destroyed. I mean, our brains are 25% cholesterol by dry weight. Our neurons are surrounded by myelin sheaths, which allows the neural transmission to occur, and it's cholesterol that is the critical factor in producing myelin sheaths and looking after our neurons, just for one thing. So this wild concept. I mean, the stuff that Uffe did and I've read is that also LDL has an immune role in the bloodstream. There's one very interesting study that was done in the Netherlands, actually done by a very pro-statin, pro-cholesterol hypothesis guy, who found that they went back and looked at the genetic people who would have had LDL, raised LDL and familial hypercholesterolemia through their family tree. So they could link this back. So they looked at headstones, went back through about 160 years to say, well, what happened to these people in the past? And what they found was in the mid to 19th century, people with high LDL familial hypercholesterolemia lived a lot longer than the surrounding population. Around about 1900, 1910, 20, that changed over. So people with high LDL lived shorter, and then it came back down again. So the explanation for this in part is probably that during the 19th century, the commonest cause of death for human beings was infectious diseases. This was the thing that killed people. This was the big scourge, apart from things like syphilis. But if you got a cut in your hand and a bacterial infection, that was it. You were gone, virtually. I mean, before antibiotics, these were real things. So, but actually, they found that LDL helps the immune system to bind to bacteria, to isolate them, and then allow them to be absorbed by white cells. So they have quite a strong function to play in the immune system. And if you look at people with higher LDL levels, they're less likely to die of sepsis, etc., etc. They have that's not their primary role, but they've obviously developed and that's become part of a thing that they do, because the body's decided anything that floats around in the body, we better get it to do more than one thing. We'll get it to do a few things, and this is one of the things that it does. And of course, our cells absolutely require cholesterol. They need it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a thing called an LDL receptor. Of course, the interesting thing about the LDL receptor is an LDL molecule comes floating along, here's a receptor, locks onto it, gets drawn into the cell. That's how it works, if you like. And another paper that we did with Uffe and a couple of other people, what we found was that actually it's the LDL receptor itself doesn't just get rid of LDL. It also has a very important factor in blood clotting. So if you have a reduced number of LDL receptors, you'll actually have a much higher level of factor VIII, just for one example, which is one of the most important clotting factors in your blood. And therefore, if you take two strands of people, and you can find that people who are related to each other, one like their brothers, one has the high LDL, the other one doesn't have the high LDL. One can have the clotting factor problem, the other one has a clotting factor problem. It's not the LDL difference that's the problem, it's the clotting factors that are the problem, because these two things sit very close together and loci on your genes. So actually you can see that actually it's probably when you have a high LDL level, because you have less LDL receptors, it's probably not the LDL that's the problem in those that it's the problem. It's the problem is you don't have enough LDL receptors. The LDL receptor does far more things than just remove LDL from the body. So again, with people, they've taken a very simplistic view of a thing, and then they haven't looked beyond that. But I mean, going back again to the good things that LDL does, well, of course it does good things. It also, and this is another area that I've looked at, which is going to confuse you probably because you're not aware of this, is that when blood clots form in the bloodstream, all right? So say there's damage and blood clots form. One of the key surfaces on which blood clots are formed, the fibrin is created. They're called lipid surfaces. So actually VLDL and LDL actually are the surfaces on which fibrin is held, linked together to form the stabilizing part of the blood clot, which is one of the reasons why you find LDL inside blood clots, because this correlation between blood clotting and lipids is quite strong. So, this is moving maybe beyond what other people are aware of. But I've tried to look in many ways as what has this connection been? Everyone can't have been completely stupid for the last 100 years. Well, maybe they have been. So there's some functioning going on here that's interesting, but they've got it all the wrong way round as usual, rather than the right way around. So you look at the people and think, the body is more complicated than you think. And LDL, you've just vilified it as the villain, and you've just got it all upside down and the wrong way around. You know, just it's the upside down world again. You know, it's step back. You know, stop trying to fit everything into the wrong model. I sometimes, in the book I'm writing at the moment, I've used the model. I've taken it in and put it out, which is, if you're doing a jigsaw puzzle and you're given a 2,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and someone gives you 2 pieces and says these 2 pieces must sit in the middle of the jigsaw puzzle. All the other pieces, they have to be made to fit around these 2 pieces. And these 2 pieces were saturated fat and raised LDL, and they got stuck right in the middle of the jigsaw puzzle. And then for the last 70, 80, 100 years, people have had to make every other piece fit around it, which is why you've ended up with this oxidized LDLs and small dense LDLs and HDLs and VLDLs and proportion of LDL to VLDL. It's just a constant effort to try and make something that doesn't fit. You just said, I'll tell you what you need to do. You need to get these 2 bits. And what you need to do is you need to throw them away. Start again, and you can create a jigsaw puzzle that makes sense. But at the moment, all of these complications are really created by the fact they've tried to force every single piece of evidence to fit around these 2 bits. It doesn't fit. It never fitted. You got it wrong. Go away and try again. Sorry, I went a bit off beam there. But
I love it. But Malcolm, if LDL isn't involved in atherosclerosis, how are we going to sell statins?
Well, we don't need to sell statins anymore because the new cholesterol-lowering agents are here.
Well,
PCSK9 inhibitors.
I know, and we'll talk about both of those, but I love that. So I'll highlight a few things. If people want to learn more about familial hypercholesterolemia, I talked about that in the last podcast that it was Ivor Cummins. And in that podcast as well, we hinted at the fact that in a lot of people with familial hypercholesterolemia, there are metabolism defects. Dave Feldman has kind of highlighted this point that familial hypercholesterolemia is a very bad model system for saying that LDL causes atherosclerosis, because there is LDL receptor problems in many of these people. So there are polymorphisms in our genetics which affect LDL receptors, leading to hypercholesterolemia in people, which is familial in many people. And there's also, in many times, associated problems in clotting factors, hypercoagulability that can co-occur in some people, but not all people with familial hypercholesterolemia. So listen to the podcast I did with Ivor. We highlight in that podcast that across people with familial hypercholesterolemia, a genetic predisposition to high levels of LDL, there is no clear correlation between levels of LDL and heart disease incidence. There are other factors that are being missed. And again, it's just like Malcolm is saying, in Western medicine, we're trying to fit this, we're trying to use 2 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. We're just trying to fit a square peg into a round hole furiously. And I don't know why people are so focused on this. I also talk about Smith-Lemli Oppitz syndrome in my book, as well as there's these experiments that have been done in rats and mice showing that when they increase the amount of cholesterol in rats, they're much more resistant, to infection. So LDL is doing all these valuable things in the human body. Smith-Lemli Oppitz syndrome is a great model system for that. And in that condition, when we give people back cholesterol, they are much more resistant to infections. So super interesting stuff. Should we move on? Should we talk about nitric oxide? Because then that'll get us into a few more things.
Yeah, sure. I mean, nitric oxide, my favorite molecule.
Yeah.
I was going to get a T-shirt made with say yes to no.
I love that's amazing.
And then it was designed to be taken off when you went outside in the sun.
Exactly. So let's talk about that.
Well, nitric oxide was discovered, it wasn't discovered, but its role its key role in cardiovascular medicine was discovered in about 1996. Although it's fascinating that nitrates or things that you can take that increase or stimulate nitric oxide synthesis were first discovered by the workers in Alfred Nobel's dynamite factory when they were stirring the nitroglycerine mixture. The fumes were coming off, they were breathing it in. That was actually, those that had angina, the angina went away. And so they developed what they called them glycerol trinitrate tablets, but actually they're nitroglycerine. You put them under your tongue, big storm of nitric oxide synthesis production due to this. Your arteries open up, the blood vessels open up, the blood pressure goes down, and all is well. Now, nobody knew it was nitric oxide. They called a thing called endothelial dilation factor, EDRF, endothelial something relaxing factor, I can't remember. And it was then discovered it was this gas, nitric oxide. Well, it's a gas, nitric oxide, NO. And when people tell me that free radicals are damaging to the body, I say, you want to know nitric oxide, one nitrogen atom, one oxygen atom, the freest of free radicals. And yet it's the most potent anticoagulant and cardiovascular resistant thing you have in your system. So it essentially anything that increases nitric oxide but doesn't increase it too far has been found to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. Anything that reduces nitric oxide has been found to increase the risk. It's really as simple as that. Nitric oxide is essential for cardiovascular health. So what sort of things damage nitric oxide production? Well, smoking obviously does it. Diabetes does it. So the kind of things that we know, there's a couple of others that people don't know. There's PPIs. Proton.
I wanted to highlight that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a clear biochemical pathway by which PPIs reduce nitric oxide synthesis, and observational studies have shown that it can increase or double the risk of cardiovascular disease. And so ironically, of course, we give people aspirin to protect them against heart disease with blood clots. And then in order to protect their stomach, we give them PPIs. So actually, you're probably increasing their risk of heart disease simultaneously. I mean, this is the kind of bonkers stuff we get into. So, I mean, there are many things that can reduce nitric oxide and certain things that can increase it. Sunshine is one of your best. Sunlight on the skin creates nitric oxide. And a study in Denmark on women showed that the women who avoided sun exposure, the risk of avoiding sun exposure was equivalent to smoking. In other words, these women, by avoiding the sun, were causing themselves as much harm as they would have done by smoking 20 cigarettes a day. That's the nonsense that we get up to. Other things that will increase nitric oxide, surprise, exercise, beetroots. Anything that will increase your nitric oxide will do that. Relaxation, that'll do it as well. So try and get your nitric oxide up. I mean, it's one of the things that you know that Viagra does, is it increases nitric oxide synthesis, obviously in the penis, and that opens up the blood vessels and allows you to have an erection. And also nitric oxide, Viagra is now used for people who've got pulmonary hypertension, high blood pressure in the arteries in their lungs, because it opens up the arteries and reduces the blood pressure. It was originally developed as an angina tablet, which many people don't know. So nitric oxide is I would say, I mean, it's not the absolutely only thing, but also nitric oxide stops blood clots forming. It's released by endothelial cells to speak to each other, to increase their resistance. It goes to the bone marrow to produce endothelial progenitor cells, increase production of endothelial progenitor cells. I mean, you need this stuff. It's absolutely critical. I don't think you can say any more than that.
It's critical. And just so listeners can understand, it's produced within the endothelial cell generally by an enzyme called eNOS, endothelial nitric oxide synthase. And there's other enzymes, iNOS, inducible nitric oxide synthase. And there's an enzyme that breaks down nitric oxide. And that, I believe, if I'm thinking about it correctly, that is what Viagra is inhibiting, is an enzyme that's kind of breaking down nitric oxide, PDE, phosphodiesterase 5 or something like that, right?
Yes, that's my understanding of it. Yeah.
A PDE5 inhibitor. So I just want to highlight a few things for people here and give some perspective on all of this. One of the things that I thought about earlier that I'll just bring up now. Are you familiar with research that shows that non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs affect the glycocalyx negatively? Because I bet they do.
I know that what they do is they increase blood coagulation.
Right.
So I've kind of put their negative effect more to the increase in blood clots forming. But I haven't looked at that, actually. I mean, I've looked at so many things. Maybe I have looked at it and just forgotten. But it'd be interesting to find out if they did. All I'd say is when I look at things on three basic things, three mechanisms. Do they damage the endothelium? Do they increase blood clotting? Or do they interfere with the healing system? And non-steroidals interfere with the healing system because that's what they're designed to do. They're anti-inflammatory. Right. And they also increase blood clotting. So I haven't looked at their direct effect on endothelial cells, but I suspect they probably have got one as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder. I wonder about that. And I just think it's interesting to highlight for people that so many of the drugs that we are commonly using in Western medicine can have both good and bad effects on the endothelium, good and bad effects on things that we are doing in the body. Proton pump inhibitors, I want to highlight this for people. I pulled up a paper. Let me actually just let me see if I can do a screen share. For those of you guys on YouTube, you'll see this. For those who are not on YouTube, you can look at the Instagram snippet that I'll make of this. Long-term use of proton pump inhibitors, dose-dependent relationship, associated risk of ischemic stroke and myocardial infarction. Proton pump inhibitors inhibit the production, as we're talking about, they're going to decrease nitric oxide. They're used in the gut. They're used in the stomach when we get excess acid production. And use of PPIs was associated with increased risks of first-time ischemic stroke and MI, particularly among long-term users at high doses. This is probably not something we want to be doing to ourselves, you guys. Why are we using proton pump inhibitors to treat gastroesophageal reflux in millions and millions of people without trying to correct the root cause of gastroesophageal reflux? These are harming us. And if you look at the literature on PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, it is vast. It is scary. They've also been associated with increased rates of dementia. But this cardiovascular effect of PPIs is bad news. You guys, it's bad news. It's so striking. So I love that you highlighted sun as well. I'm a huge proponent of sunlight. It feels good on our skin. And I've said this to my clients. I've said this perhaps other times as well within podcasts. Vitamin D supplementation is not equivalent to ultraviolet light. Dermatologists here and in the United Kingdom want to say, never go out in the sun. You should be as white as a sheet, cover every inch of your body with sunscreen, which, by the way, we know has xenoestrogenic compounds in it that can affect the thyroid negatively. But don't ever get exposed to UV light. You'll never get a skin cancer. Oh, by the way, you'll also never make nitric oxide in your skin, which is super valuable for your health of your arteries. And I love that you're highlighting this, that women who have lower sun exposure, that is the same risk as smoking in that study. It's just, we need to be in the sun. And one of the themes that keeps coming up for me in this podcast is Goldilocks, the sweet spot. We don't want too much sun, but we can't have none. So what is an ancestrally appropriate amount of sun? Well, that's reasonable. Get a small tan or a little bit of color, but go in the sun, you guys. Like, do not fear the sun. If you have a history of skin cancer in your family, obviously be careful, but you have to manage this properly. Ultraviolet light is a nutrient for humans. It cannot be substituted with a vitamin D pill. So I love that. And, Viagra, as we said, that can increase nitric oxide. That's been associated with slightly improved cardiac outcomes. All these things, super important. Probably the thing that we just don't want to do is inhibit the production of nitric oxide with medications if we don't know that we're doing it inadvertently. I know that people listening to this podcast have friends and family on proton pump inhibitors. I'm never going to give medical advice in a podcast, but they need to know that this could increase their risk of vascular issues. So I really wanted to highlight that. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to plaque formation or clot formation in the arterial wall. This is interesting, and it'll probably lead us to a discussion of Lp(a). So Lp(a) is a confusing particle for people. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about how you think Lp(a) is playing into this equation. And so we get damage to the artery wall. We've been exposed to smoking or cigarettes, or smoking and cigarettes, or we've been exposed to, we're insulin resistant. Hopefully nobody listening to this podcast is insulin resistant. The artery wall is damaged. What do you think happens next?
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward in that it's been known for many years that if you create damage to the endothelium, go back to a very unpleasant experiment they carried out on pigs, where they anesthetized them, opened up their aortas, scraped the endothelium off, stitched it up again, and then left them for like 2 days, 4 days, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then killed them and had a look at what happened and today, what was actually going on in the areas where they damaged the endothelium. Well, the first thing that happens is obviously a blood clot forms, because the endothelium is obviously lining the artery walls. Sitting within the artery walls, there's lots of things, but we'll stick to one thing. It's called tissue factor. Tissue factor is the most potent procoagulant, causes blood clots to form substance there is. It sits inside artery walls for obvious reasons, in that if you damage the artery, the body thinks it's potentially under threat. So Are you hearing a funny noise in the background? I'm hearing that too.
No, I don't hear it.
I'm hearing it. I'm hearing like a heartbeat. Boom, boom. Might stop. Anyway, you can cut that. I'll start again. All right. We'll get to the. No, I was hearing it. You were looking around, so you were hearing it as well. I just thought you might want to cut it at that point. We'll go back to. So I'll start with the pigs again, will I, or will I just there was,
you just keep going, yeah.
Right, it doesn't matter. So they did this thing, and then they found a blood clot forms, quite a big one, all right, and then it gradually shrinks down in size, and then you start to see endothelial cells grow on top of it, and then the whole thing is incorporated into the artery wall. Obviously, this is the only one-off, so they can't see it happening in a repeated fashion. But essentially, the tissue factor that sits in the artery wall bypasses all of the clotting factors in what you call the clotting cascade. So, you normally have all these factors, 6 and 8 and 5 and whatever, all doing their thing. And then you get thrombin turns to prothrombin turns to prothrombin, which sticks fibrin together. But if you damage the artery wall, it's almost like you switch the whole system into hyperdrive, and a clot forms very quickly. All right, this has been known for years and years and years. So what actually is attracted to that area? One of the things that's attracted to that area, first off, is lipoprotein A. You said, let's talk about lipoprotein A. The fascinating thing about lipoprotein A is it's exactly the same as LDL. It's the same thing as LDL, the same size, same structure. The only difference is that LPA has got an extra protein attached around it. I call it like LDL with a scarf wrapped around it, or whatever it is. This protein is fascinating in many ways, but then with the LPA is attached, sticks into the artery wall, and is very difficult to remove from it for obvious reasons. You don't want any plaque, any clot that forms. Some of it needs to sustain there until all of the repair has occurred. So you tend to get a higher concentration of LPA at that point. Just to say that LPA is genetically determined. You've got a high level or you've got a low level, and there's not a huge amount you can do about it. That's just one of those things. But anyway, so the LPA comes along, sticks to the artery wall, and the thing that shaves blood clots down, when a blood clot forms, obviously if a blood clot formed and it couldn't be shaved down, then it would just stay there forever. It can't do that. So you have to be able to get rid of it. So you have to get rid of that by breaking down the fibrin, which is a long, sticky strand of protein that holds the whole thing together. So you chop the fibrin apart, and then the clot starts to dissolve. Not all of it. The reason why that happens is every time a clot forms, there's a protein stuck inside it called plasminogen. Plasminogen does nothing until it's activated. It's activated by tissue plasminogen activator, which people will be given after a heart attack and a stroke, TPA, tissue plasminogen activator, turns plasminogen into plasmin. Plasmin slices fibrin apart, and the clot is removed, all right? Hold that thought in your head. You've got LPA. LPA has this extra protein wrapped around it called apolipoprotein A. That's why it's called LPA. Apolipoprotein A has the same structure as plasminogen, except for a fold at the end. So say plasminogen folds that way, and apolipoprotein A folds that away. What that means is the enzyme can't get at it, can't make it work. It blocks the actions of TPA, so that part of the sections of the blood clot cannot be broken down. So it remains stuck. Now, some people think, and I agree with them, that LPA was a genetic adaptation to the fact that humans can't synthesize vitamin C. We lost that ability 40 million years ago, along with some of the great apes, fruit bats, and guinea pigs, and one or two other mammals. Now, why we lost this ability, who knows, but we did. Possibly because there was plenty of vitamin C around, and it was a bit of a waste of time making it ourselves. So the problem with vitamin C is that vitamin C is critical in producing collagen. Collagen is the reinforced, as the steel bars in reinforced concrete. It holds all your tissues together. If you start to lose collagen, you will disintegrate. So if you don't have vitamin C, you don't have collagen, and the first thing to disintegrate are your blood vessels. So you start to bleed. So your gums bleed, and then you bleed to death, and then you die.
Scurvy.
So scurvy kills you from bleeding to death. Now you've got these cracking open blood vessels. Well, in order to stay alive a bit longer, along comes LPA, sticks like, whatever, it sticks really hard, prevents the blood vessels from breaking down. Now that's a very good thing if your blood vessels are breaking up due to vitamin C deficiency. However, you don't want almost impossible to remove blood clots stuck to your artery walls. So what you say is people with higher LPA levels, if they do get damage, the resultant clot formation is going to be much more difficult to get rid of. So the plaques that form will just remain more difficult to get rid of. So that's how LPA, in a way, can increase the risk of dying of heart disease. So in a way, it's like LDL does cause heart disease, it's just called LPA. And you can understand that, and that's due to blood clotting. So if you don't have problems with your blood vessels, there's no cracking forming, LPA is irrelevant. So only once you start to get that damage. Now the damage could be vitamin C deficiency, and I know that some people, Linus Pauling, believed all heart disease was due to subclinical vitamin C deficiency, and if you took enough vitamin C, you could stop all your blood vessels cracking, you would never get atherosclerosis. Now I personally think vitamin C deficiency is a problem for some people, and it does cause atherosclerosis a bit in some people, but it's only a small subsection of an answer. It's not the whole answer to everything. I see this with a lot of people. They find things like homocysteine, which damages artery walls, and say everything's due to homocysteine. So well, homocysteine doesn't cause heart disease in sickle cell disease, does it? Nor is it a factor in smoking. You have to accept that there is not a single factor that causes coronary artery cardiovascular disease, whatever you want to cause it. What you have to look at it is a process which can be accelerated by certain things or decelerated by certain things. And it'd be hundreds of factors. So I say to people, I use another analogy, which is rust on a car. So you normally won't get rust on a car bodywork unless you damage the bodywork in some way. And then you expose the metal underneath to water. And I know that doesn't happen in California, but in Scotland it happens a lot. Cars just rust really quickly. So the first thing that you have to do is that damage. And then you say, well, what can damage the artery wall? Well, what can damage the artery walls? A stone, another car, a brick. It's not the thing itself. You can't look at the thing itself and say, aha, this is the thing that causes heart disease, because its structure gives you no clue. A roof rack falls off your car and causes the same problem as a stone. Well, hold them together in your hand and say, what brings these two things together? What brings them together is damage. And that's what brings things together that cause heart disease generally: damage or increased blood clotting. I mean, there's conditions where you get this thing called Hughes syndrome, where you're much more likely to create blood clots, and it's much more likely to kill you of cardiovascular disease than, say, LDL, even if you believe that. What's the problem? Blood clotting. So you have to try and look at these things as a process and what increases this process. LPA doesn't damage artery walls.
Exactly.
It doesn't interfere with the healing process. What it does is it means that whatever blood clot is formed is a bloody sight more difficult to get rid of. And that's where its problem occurs, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. And I think that I'll just talk about that a little more so people understand it. We'll sort of summarize it again. I love that you said that at the end. That was the point that I wanted to highlight. People get worried because their cardiologist or their internist will say, you have a high LP(a), you need statins. And I don't think that's the whole story. Like you're saying, I do not think there's good evidence that LP(a), that lipoprotein(a), as you say, is an LDL molecule with a lipoprotein, an apolipoprotein(a). Like you said, it's a scarf. If people want to see the pictures, they can look up LP(a). It looks like LDL with a scarf because that apolipoprotein(a) is a scarf. It has these Kringle domains. It has these bending domains in LP(a) in the apolipoprotein(a) molecule. And apolipoprotein(a), like you said, looks just like plasminogen. And it can inhibit or it can be involved in this clotting cascade. So I think you're totally right. Like, this is a very plausible explanation that LP(a) may be involved in the repair of our blood vessels. So when we genetically have high LP(a), we may have hypercoagulability, just like somebody that has a factor VIII polymorphism or other hypercoagulable mutations. Now, this probably is not an issue unless we damage the arteries. And so we come back to the proximal event. And I love that we're just sort of highlighting this for people. Atherosclerosis is a multi-step process. It has to start. It starts with endothelial damage, and LP(a), LDL do not damage arteries. But we talked about all the things that can damage arteries. If we keep the arteries healthy, all of these factors kind of fall away and will probably not be a big problem. Some of us were probably predisposed to having higher LP(a) for some reason genetically. Maybe it was a survival advantage. Maybe it has to do with vitamin C. I'll comment on that in a moment. But some of us have low LP(a). But in those who have high LP(a), we might think about this as hypercoagulability, meaning don't damage your arteries. It's just really important for those people not to smoke, not to have lead poisoning, not to be in places with high air pollution, not to be insulin resistant, not to do all these things that damage the arteries, not to do other things that could interfere with the process of healing, wound healing, NSAIDs, corticosteroids, all these things. It's this multi-step process. The vitamin C thing I think is quite intriguing. I do think that if we don't get enough vitamin C, the arteries can fall apart. That's what we know as scurvy. What we have not seen, or what I have not seen, is that Linus Pauling's theory hold much water. I don't think that atherosclerosis, as you're suggesting, is invariably vitamin C deficiency. And I don't think that everyone with atherosclerosis needs more vitamin C, or that we could cure atherosclerosis with megadoses of vitamin C. One of the things I've talked about with a number of people on my podcast with regard to a carnivore diet is what is the ideal amount of vitamin C for humans? How much do we need? I'm still open to this and trying to learn. I don't think we should get too little. And I don't think we know how much is too little or too much. I don't believe that Linus Pauling's ideas around 5,000 milligrams or 10,000 milligrams of vitamin C seem to be effective. What we know with people in a carnivore community is that moderate amounts of vitamin C appear to be able to prevent scurvy just fine. I don't have scurvy, and I'm not getting 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C per day in my diet. But I think there's a question of what is the sweet spot for vitamin C in the human diet? I do think it's interesting to imagine why we might have lost the ability to synthesize it. There were these two lineages of apes, the Stepsarinci and the Haplorinci, or Haplorini. And I believe it was the Haplorini lineage of apes about 40 to 60 million years ago that lost the ability. And as you suggest, I think it must have been due to an abundance of vitamin C in the environment, an abundance of vitamin C in our world. So we didn't need it. And we probably didn't need 5,000 milligrams a day because it's basically impossible to get Linus Pauling doses of vitamin C in the natural world. So if not getting 5,000 milligrams of vitamin C were not advantageous for humans, we can imagine that population of people that had that mutation, or these were pre-humans, these were Haplorini apes, would not have been selected for. So it's a quite interesting story in that regard as well. So I love this LP(a), you guys, LDL, small amount of it has apolipoprotein on the edge, like a scarf, kind of sticks in the clots. It's hypercoagulability, but you got to damage the arteries first. Let's talk a little bit about statins, because I want to make sure we get to this, and we're already deep in rabbit holes, and this podcast is already full of amazing stuff. Statins.
I'm just going to take you back into another vitamin C issue, which is to do with infections, because it is true that actually bacterial infections can damage the artery walls due to the production of exotoxins, which is what the bacteria produce.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when you get to things like when you have sepsis, the thing that kills you is actually the exotoxins.
Right.
Cause damage to the endothelium and the organs that you get disseminated intravascular coagulation. In other words, small blood clots throughout the whole body. That's why your legs and arms fall off, because the blood circulation is shut down when you have sepsis of whatever sort. And in fact, if you give very high doses of vitamin C to people who are in this situation, there's been some studies showing that in fulminant sepsis, you can reduce the mortality rate from 40% to 8% by giving high doses of vitamin C. So there is another connection with endothelial damage and vitamin C, not necessarily to do with blood clotting or cracking of the arteries. It can actually be appears to be directly protective. So whenever I get in a cold or a flu or something like that, I do whack vitamin C in. I'll take 10 grams a day. Whether it works or not, I'm still alive.
Who knows? I think in the setting of sepsis, it's a unique example, and I wonder if it is having to do with that endothelial damage. And this actually reiterates what we were talking about earlier. Those endotoxins or exotoxins, they're almost synonymous. So endotoxin is lipopolysaccharide. It comes from gram-negative bacteria. Exotoxins is a little broader term of bacterial toxins. But LDL has been shown to quench these endotoxins, right? So I want to just reiterate this for all the listeners, that in settings of sepsis, and this is what we talked about, higher LDL is probably protective because all of these exotoxins and or more specifically endotoxin lipopolysaccharide, LDL can manage those and prevent toxicity around those. So that's super fascinating. All of the people who believe LDL is bad for you need to listen to that and think about it in sepsis, because if they get a lot of anyone on a statin who gets septic is going to be in a world of hurt because they have less LDL to take care of those bacterial products. So let's talk about statins. These are drugs that inhibit an enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase, which is part of the mevalonate pathway. The mevalonate pathway is the pathway in our body by which we synthesize cholesterol. Humans make cholesterol. Also in this pathway, which is enumerated in my book, is the fact that acetyl-CoA from ketones participate in the same pathway. So in order to make ketones, we also have to make HMG-CoA, which is the precursor for ketones. So isn't it interesting that the synthesis of ketones in our body and the synthesis of cholesterol share a common pathway? But statins break the formation of HMG-CoA. They inhibit HMG-CoA. Well, they don't break the formation of HMG-CoA. They break the next step, which is HMG-CoA reductase, and further down. So what are your feelings about statins? Let's talk about this pros and cons. And I've never done this on an episode, so it'll be interesting.
Well, the pros are they made $1 trillion in profit for the pharmaceutical industry. So lots of people have done very well out of them.
Yes.
One of the interesting things is they actually increase nitric oxide synthesis.
That's what I was going to ask you about.
Which is something almost no doctor knows about, but I know about it because I looked at. They've got all sorts of other effects. So we say that. The beneficial effect, in my opinion, is primarily because of NO synthesis. Now, why they do this, there's complex pathways, but it's known to do this. So they do have that benefit. And when people say they've been shown to have benefit, I say, yes, but I think it's got nothing to do with the LDL lowering once again, because the other medications, for instance, there was a class of medications that never got launched. Each one of them lowered LDL by as much as statins, and had no effect on cardiovascular disease. These are the torosotrapim and evacitrapim drugs, which were designed primarily to raise HDL, but they also lowered LDL. So then you look at this and say, well, they did it by as much as statins had no effect. So surely you must agree it must be something to do with something else that statins do. So they do appear to have a benefit on cardiovascular disease. That benefit depends on how much benefit you want in life. But essentially, the study that I look at is the problem is, of course, that the statistics on them is presented in certain ways to make them sound terrifically beneficial. So, for instance, there's a study came out showing Lipitor reduced the risk of heart attacks by 36%. Now, those figures are true, but when you reanalyze them and say, okay, well, what's a heart attack? Well, heart attacks are not necessarily fatal. Heart attacks can be very mild. One of the problems with the statin trials is a heart attack's a heart attack, whether it killed you or caused a transient raise in enzymes. So you have a huge different outcomes that are all pooled into one outcome, which is a bad thing anyway. But anyway, to set that aside, that same study showed that the number of fatal heart attacks reduced was 0. The total number of heart attacks, the reduction in heart attacks, and they do this thing called relative and absolute risk. The absolute risk in heart attacks was 1.2% over 5 years, which then, due to statistical manipulation, 1.2% versus 2.whatever%, the different 1.8%, the difference is 33% between those two figures. Maybe I should explain that again. So say you do a study where you give somebody an antihypertensive. You give it to 100 people. 100 people get the antihypertensive, 100 people get the placebo. At the end of the trial, one person dies in the active drug arm, 2 people die in the placebo arm. So that's 2 versus 1. 99% of people are still alive in this arm, and 98% are still alive in this arm. The absolute difference in mortality is 1%. The relative difference is 2 versus 1, that's 50%. So you can do the same trial in 1,000 people. At the end of the trial, one person dies in one arm, 2 people die in the other arm. The difference in absolute terms is 0.1%. The relative difference remains 1 versus 2, 50%. So you can do the same study in 10,000 people, 1 million people. And if it's 2 versus 1, the relative difference is still 50%, but the absolute difference becomes like 0.0000001%. In other words, who gives a? It's so small it's not worth doing. So the pharmaceutical industry present benefits as relative differences. They present harms as absolute difference. So they'll say, oh, there's only a 1% increase in diabetes risk. Yes, but that's an absolute difference. But actually it's more than that, but that's how they do it. So
With statins.
Yeah.
And we can highlight that statins do increase diabetes risk. We'll highlight that in a second.
Well, it is true. So they do a mismatch outcomes. They give you non-fatal outcomes. They manipulate the statistics as much as they can. But the end result, from my point of view, is to say, if you took a statin for, say, 5 years, which is the average length of these clinical trials, how much longer could you expect to live? Because that's the only really important matter on this. And the answer is, if you take a statin for 5 years, what they call primary prevention, the increase in life expectancy is 3 days. And if you take it in secondary prevention, it's 4.1 days. So you get approximately 0.75 days for a year of taking a statin. That's the best possible outcome from the best possible studies. So that's the bottom line. That's the figure you need to concentrate on. All this 33% reduction in that and 45% reduction in this. Unless you know what the absolute reduction is, the relative reduction is meaningless. And that's what you are presented with. So there has been huge statistical manipulation. And the only other thing I'd say before shutting up on this is, there's only one major statin trial carried out not by a pharmaceutical company. And that was called ULHAT LLT. It was done by the National Institutes of Health, and it was on pravastatin. And at the end of 5 years, they found no benefit on any cardiovascular outcome and no benefit on mortality outcome. So there was like 35 positive studies from the industry, 1 negative study, not sponsored by the industry. Now you can make your own conclusions from that. I know what my conclusions are. So I'm serious doubts about some of this. The other thing I would say is that statin trials are not double-blind. I know they're set up as double-blind, and that neither the patient nor the doctor knows whether they're getting the tablet. But the patient will know what their cholesterol level is, and so will the doctor. And the moment you see the cholesterol level, you know whether you'll be given a statin or not. Now, I know that in the later PCSK inhibitors, one of the investigators was giving a presentation, and I was presenting as well. And he said, one of the patients came up and said, I know I'm not on the active drug. And they said, how do you know that? He said, because my cholesterol level hasn't fallen. And they said, well, why are you still on the drug? He said, well, I want to carry on because I want to do good for humanity and stuff like that. So the reality is, if you're in a clinical trial, you must tell anybody involved in your care, if you're admitted to hospital, that you are taking part in a clinical trial. And they then must find out whether or not you're taking the medication or not. These trials are not blinded. So observer bias becomes hugely important. And this is something I've never seen discussed, but I think it's hugely important. So I think there are problems with the trials. I think the data are presented in certain ways. I think the bottom line is that there does seem to be some benefit in all the pharmaceutical company-sponsored trials. What causes that benefit? I'm not sure. But does it, I think it may be the nitric oxide, does that balance out against the harms that statins can do? Exactly. Now, in my opinion, no. They just don't.
Yeah. So why don't you talk a little bit about what you think are the harms of statins, and then I'll kind of sum it all up. But I'll just highlight for people that there are these pleiotropic effects of statins. And I love that you highlighted this. If we look at medications that only lower LDL, there are lots of medications that only lower LDL that do not work through the same mechanism as statins, that do not have the same pharmacology as statins. You mentioned many of them. Some of them are still on the market. Some of them are not. Cholestyramine is one. It's a bile acid sequestrant. There are others that inhibit the absorption of LDL from the gut. These medications do not show cardiovascular risk change. So for people to say that statins lowering LDL, and that means statins lowering LDL, statins show some improvement in cardiovascular outcomes, therefore LDL is causing cardiovascular disease, that's so silly. There are these pleiotropic effects of statins. They do appear to increase nitric oxide, which is so consistent with everything we've been saying. So yes, you can make a case that statins do have some positive effect, but I love that we must highlight what are the negative effects of statins. This is the same way that I think about plant compounds like polyphenols, you can demonstrate a beneficial effect. What about all the negative effects that we are never talked about? And I love that you highlight that pharmaceutical companies misrepresent how these are reported. They will report relative risk reduction for benefits and absolute risk, absolute risk of harms. And this is the same thing that I see when we're thinking about plant molecules, is that often, because I think people want to sell pharmaceuticals, they want to sell supplements, the benefits are overemphasized and the risks are de-emphasized. So what have you seen as the risks? What do we know about the negatives of taking statins?
Well, there's some that are well known. I mean, the diabetes risk, and I've seen that up to 363% relative increase in risk with diabetes. But with diabetes being that common, that's quite a significant absolute risk as well, like 2 or 3% increase in risk. Muscle pains, joint pains, yes, definitely, absolutely. I do know there's a study in the States, which was it's not called now, but it was looking at how long people kept taking their statins for, and basically after about 2 years, 75% given up, 63% of them given up said it was due to adverse effects. Now I know the studies, the clinical trials have said, oh, there's no adverse effects and it's all a nocebo effect, which is complete nonsense. I remember a couple of years ago I was speaking to someone, doing a little interview in my kitchen, and there was a guy who was doing some work on, I can't remember what he was doing, he was working on something to do with windows in my house, and I was talking about this, and he said, can I just interrupt you? Because I was talking about irritation and irritability and anger, which is something that's very rarely reported. And he said, oh, my wife went on statins 6 months ago, and since then she's become, I can't live with her anymore. She's shouting, she's yelling, she's really bad tempered. I said, well, there you go. I mean, I've seen so many cases of people coming to me. I know that the experts all tell me this is just all in people's minds, but this is nonsense. Because one thing they do in the statin trials, they have a run-in period in many of them, where anyone who exhibits an adverse effect is taken out of the trial. So I said, well, you remove everyone that's suffering an adverse effect. Of course, you've got to remove the same number of people from the placebo arm. So no wonder you don't see these adverse effects. I mean, the most worrying one is Beatrice Goleman is looking at statins, and she's from California somewhere over your way. And she found that it increases the risk of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis by up to 50-fold. That's 5,000%. And that's a really serious worry. And it kind of fits the World Health Organization, got a warning signal about that as well before this was picked up. And when you know the importance of cholesterol in nerve cells and their health and their production, the idea that you could be damaging nerve cells by lowering cholesterol isn't really very far-fetched. I mean, other things that they can cause, I had a lady who was in a hospital with such severe abdominal pain, they were going to do a laparotomy, open up, find out what's going on. I said, it might be the statins causing this, and she went, blue. Anyway, she stopped them for a month, all the pain went away, gone. I mean, according to the statistics, I should have seen maybe 2 people with a statin adverse effect in my career. I've seen, I haven't kept tally, I should have 50 people with rhabdomyolysis of one level or another. I mean, I just think this is just a monstrous, and I have fellow doctors who write to me saying, well, so many people get problems with them and adverse effects. But then how many people fill in? We have a yellow card system here. If someone has an adverse effect, a patient, you're supposed to fill in a yellow card and send it to the Medicines Evaluation Agency. How many get filled in? 1 in 1,000, I don't know, 1 in 1,000,000. The adverse effect reporting system is rubbish, and yet it's what we apparently have to go on. So I think that personally, if you have had a heart attack and you go on a statin and you're getting absolutely no adverse effects, stay on it. For almost everyone else, I just really don't think the benefits outweigh the potential damage and harm that these things cause. That's my position on this.
Yeah. And so as we talked about with the mevalonate pathway, downstream of HMG-CoA is coenzyme Q10. When we inhibit the production of the next steps in the pathway, squalene, other things, there are many compounds made from HMG-CoA besides cholesterol. We know that cholesterol is beneficial because you need cholesterol to make membranes of the body, right? We probably should not inhibit the formation of cholesterol. Every cell in your body needs it in the membrane. And downstream from HMG-CoA is also coenzyme Q10, which is in every mitochondria in your body. And so inhibiting the production of one of the components of the mitochondrial electron respiratory transport chain is probably not a good idea. And it's probably why mechanistically statins increase diabetes. When you get mitochondrial dysfunction, you become insulin resistant. That is how it works. We are creating insulin resistance with statins, okay? We are also impairing the production of neuronal and all cell membranes in the body. We know that there's also concerns about dementia, especially with the lipophilic statins, especially with the statins that cross into the brain. Because if you inhibit the production of cholesterol in the brain, you are going to end up with some major things. And so ALS, so amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, is Lou Gehrig's disease. This is a very serious problem. The fact that someone is finding a 50 times increased risk of ALS with statins is strikingly scary, okay? So why are we taking statins for a benefit of nitric oxide synthesis when we can just go in the sun, when we can just exercise? I would actually respectfully disagree with you here and say that I think that even if someone has had a heart attack, I do not feel that the benefits of statins outweigh the risks. I think that we know from studies like the Lyon Diet Heart Study and other studies that we can have the same sort of cardiovascular improvements with dietary change that improves insulin resistance. And we should be telling people who have had MIs to go in the sun, you know, and we know that people who have had MIs are told to exercise, so that's good. But I think that we can get all of the benefits of statins, which are probably just a little bit of nitric oxide, by doing things that we're supposed to be doing, by doing heat exposure, sauna, cold, be in the sun, exercise. This is what I call in the book, living a radical life. So yes, statins do show benefits in many trials. I can't argue that. Is it worth the risk? I don't think it is. I don't think we should be doing this. Obviously, this is not medical advice. I would never give medical advice on a podcast. Dr. Kendrick is not giving medical advice. This is my ability to give an opinion. I think these drugs are harming us more than they're hurting us. But it's so interesting to dig into the mechanism and realize, oh, they're beneficial because of nitric oxide. Well, we talked about nitric oxide, you know, like don't take drugs that inhibit the production of nitric oxide. Do things in your life that increase nitric oxide, and you will find the benefits of a statin without all the negatives. And the psychiatric downsides of statins are staggering. There are many studies which show that violent death by suicide, by hanging, homicides increase when people take statins. But we are never told about this by the industry, you guys. This is just crazy stuff. So anyway, that's just amazing stuff. Let's wrap it up. I want to let you go. This is an amazing conversation. Thank you so much. Can you give us, let's just summarize all this. Maybe can you give us a 60-second soundbite? 60-second soundbite. How do we prevent atherosclerosis? How do we live as healthfully as possible? Then I'll offer mine and we'll wrap up and I'll go out in the sun.
Well, in 60 seconds, I think some of the obvious things that people have told you: avoid pollution. Air pollution is particularly nasty. Do exercise, definitely. Take exercise, get out in the sun. Walking outside in the sunshine is really good. Reduce stress. We haven't really talked about that, but actually negative stress can do all of the other nasty things we've said. It releases hormones that raise your blood sugar, damage your endothelium, that increase your blood clotting. So that's really important. Your things: sauna, yoga has been found to be very beneficial. There are one or two supplements that I do tend to advise people: bit of vitamin C, bit of vitamin D, magnesium, which we haven't talked about, but is also potentially quite important. And for some people who are developing atherosclerosis, K2 can be quite beneficial as well. You can go into the supplements and you can see benefits for so many of them. You can go on and on and on and on and on, but it can get a bit complicated. Avoid medications as much as possible. Just reduce your medication. Polypharmacy is another big problem. Life expectancy is falling in both the US and the UK. Not hugely dramatically, but it's falling. And I put a lot of that down to so many people being on so many medications. I think you just have to look at that. So it's like trying to live as natural an existence as you can. Good social interactions. Health has got three parts to it. It's physical, it's psychological, and it's social. Physical parts we focus on an awful lot. The psychological, friendships, sense of purpose, relaxation, stress, and the social is really important. We have to have these things in balance. And I think we've lost sight of too many of these things. So we need to balance our lives in these three different ways. So if I was going to say one thing, is look at your social life, look at your psychological life as much as your physical life in many ways. I think that's really important.
I love it. And so I would echo so many of those things. And I would add to that, eat a diet that creates insulin sensitivity, avoid insulin resistance like the plague, know how to check if you're insulin resistant versus insulin sensitive, have a healthy body composition, get your visceral adipose tissue checked, but eat a diet that provides the nutrients. And I love that you said vitamin K2, because I've talked about this before. Vitamin K2 is essentially animal vitamin K2. Yes, you can get a small amount from natto, or you can get a large amount from natto, which is fermented soybeans. But generally speaking, vitamin K2, the menaquinones, occur in animal foods. They occur in liver and heart and muscle meat and egg yolks from well-raised animals. So getting enough vitamin K2 is crucial. This is the Rotterdam study that showed that the more vitamin K2 people were getting, there was a much lower incidence of calcific aortic sclerosis and at least cardiovascular disease incidence. So eat a diet that creates insulin sensitivity. That doesn't necessarily mean a low carbohydrate diet. That you can get insulin sensitive with moderate amounts of carbohydrates, but it has to be a whole foods diet. I think a diet that includes a lot of nutrient-rich animal foods is great, but eat a diet that makes you insulin sensitive. If you are insulin resistant, you are damaging your endothelium. If you are getting postprandial hyperglycemia, you are damaging your endothelium. We do not want that to happen. And I love everything else you said: community, sun, exercise, heat, sun, cold, live a radical life. That is how we avoid atherosclerosis and avoid medications. Figure out what is causing your problems. Get to the root cause of problems. Don't treat it with medications like a PPI that are going to inhibit nitric oxide. Know what medications you're taking. Be careful, because the medications can harm us. We should not be using medications to treat symptoms. We should be finding the root cause. So hopefully that's helpful. This has been a super technical podcast. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find more of your stuff?
Well, I do a blog called drmalcolmkendrick.org, which people can come to, where I've done a hugely long series about heart disease, which may be too detailed for anybody, including myself. But a lot of people find it, they can go there and get discussions as well, which they find quite useful. So that's good. And thanks very much. I've enjoyed the chat. Yeah, I hope some people have learned something. I hope, definitely.
I think we've given people a lot of good stuff. The last question I always ask my podcast guests is, what is the most radical thing that you have done recently? This is like 80s radical. Like, what is the coolest, most radical thing you have done recently, Malcolm Kendrick?
Bought a ski chalet in the Alps. How about that?
That's amazing. Where is it? Where in the Alps?
A place called Morillon, which is in France, and fairly near to Geneva. So
that's amazing. So you like to ski?
I do. Yeah.
That's fantastic. That's amazing. Well, I hope that someday you and I get to eat a steak together, and maybe we can even go skiing.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank
you very much.
Thank you so much.
Did you know I wrote a book? It's called The Carnivore Code. It's amazing. I think you should check it out. It's radical. If you be listening to this podcast and you haven't read my book, why is that? Read my book. Check it out. Let me know what you think. If you have read my book, please leave me a review on Amazon. It would be so appreciated, and we will move the movement forward. Like I said, if you are listening to this podcast the week of March the 10th, I am in New York City talking to publishers. We're going to get this book widely distributed because it is so radical, and it turned out really good. I'm also talking to them about pitching a second book, which will be super exciting, and I'm going to do some media. I'm going to be on some television and promote the book and talk about coronavirus and how you have to be nutritionally adequate to be resilient against coronavirus, right? So anyway, all the good stuff happening this week. I am in New York City. I hope to see you all at Belcampo on Tuesday night, March the 10th. Use Carnivore MD at Belcampo. Use Carnivore MD at White Oak Pastures. Use Saladino MD at Ancestral Supplements on their Shopify site, and for future.com, which is tryfuture.com/SaladinoMD, if you want to check out that app as well. All right, you guys, I'm out. I got to pack. I'm going to New York tonight. That's right. I'm recording this just a few days before the podcast. That's how I roll. I got to throw some stuff in my backpack, and believe me, there are some grass-fed steaks and organ meat waiting for me in New York City, along with many other amazing things, and hopefully some of your smiling faces on Tuesday night about Belcampo. See you guys later. Stay radical. I love you.